Good morning. Morning. Good morning. I'm so sorry to interrupt your conversations. It's fantastic to be here. My name's Chuck. I'm one of the pastors here. It's not really Chuck, but I've been called Chuck since I was 11 and it's stuck now. And we are one church that meets in many places. This morning we're joined by nearly all of them through the wonders of technology. And so a massive hello to you if you're in one of our sites that isn't here this morning. It's brilliant to have you with us. We're going to open up the scriptures as we do every time when we gather like this. The Bible is kind of a central part of our life together as a community. And we're going to be reading from Matthew chapter 9 in a moment. And so if you've got a Bible with you, either the original book version or some kind of digital device, you're welcome to turn to it. We're in a series right now called Everything Changes. And the reason it's called Everything Changes is because when you meet Jesus, that's what happens, right? And we've been following, in Matthew chapters 8 and 9, it comes immediately after a massive sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus meets lots of people back to back. And that's what we're looking at, all of these different encounters with Jesus and how everything changes for every single one of them. That's why it's called Everything Changes. I don't know whether you're like me. I'm getting loads and loads of spam phone calls at the moment. Is anyone else experiencing that? Probably 3 or 4 times a day my phone rings and it's nobody. It's like some random number. I answer it. There's nobody at the other end for quite a long time, and then maybe there's like some kind of recorded message or something like that. I don't know whether I put my details into some kind of a website or something like that. It's a nightmare. But that kind of phone call will change nothing about your life, right? You can have as many phone calls like that as you like. Nothing about your life is going to change. But I have had phone calls where something dramatic happens. I don't know whether you've ever had that. I remember exactly where I was, 2003, when the phone rang, and it was my mother-in-law to say that my wife, Taryn, had gone into labor. And I was standing next to a man from Halfords, and he was fitting a CD changer into the boot of my car. Some of you don't even know what a CD changer is. But that's what he was doing. And so I was saying to him, if you wouldn't mind just hurrying up, I don't want to miss the birth of my first child for the sake of a CD changer in my car. And so that's where I was. And a lot changed as a result of that phone call. Well, today in our passage, Matthew, who's written Matthew's gospel, is giving us a moment of autobiography. He's recorded a lot of different encounters with lots of different people. This is the moment where Matthew himself encountered Jesus and received a call that would change his life. So Matthew chapter 9, I'm going to read from verse 9. It'll come up on the screen too. It says this. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill." And that's our passage for this morning. Do you know, one of the things that strikes me about this moment between Matthew and Jesus is just the pure intimacy of this moment, right? So in Matthew's gospel, it's all about the crowds. There are crowds everywhere. He starts his gospel, Matthew chapter 1, talking about the crowds and crowds of people in the past who've led up to this moment. Abraham was the father of Isaac, well done, who was the father of Jacob. And there was also Uzziah was the father of just testing. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Crowds and crowds of people in the past who've led up to this incredible moment of incarnation, God himself coming to earth, being born and as the baby Jesus and so on. And he ends his gospel with the commissioning of the 11 disciples to go and reach the entire nations of earth, everyone on planet earth. And then in between, there are these moments where Jesus is meeting with lots of different individuals, but there are crowds everywhere. In fact, there are 41 mentions mentions of crowds in Matthew's gospel. There are crowds on the mountain side when Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount. There are crowds around by the lake. There are crowds following Jesus everywhere he goes. There are noisy crowds and crowds who are in awe and crowds who are amazed and just lots and lots of crowds. And then suddenly in this moment, all of the crowds are stripped away. And it's just Jesus and Matthew. And he stands before him. And in a sense, what Matthew's telling us is, this is the moment where Jesus stood in front of me and called my name. And I just had to respond. You know, actually, if we were to go around the room today or in one of the rooms at the other end of the cameras, what we could discover is that so many of us have got that story. You know, nearly all of us, in fact, have got that story of Jesus at some point in our lives entering into our world. And it's like all the crowds are stripped away and it's just me and Jesus, and he calls my name and I have to respond. That's happened to so many of us. It's certainly for me. I was 15 years old. I'd been investigating the claims of Jesus, which turns out isn't only a German thing. It's like it's like a common sense thing, actually, you know, to investigate the claims of Jesus, to figure out, was there a real historical Jesus? Was there, you know, is he who he says he was? And like, did he really rise from the dead? All these kinds of things that you find out on the Alpha course, which I can absolutely commend to you as just a fantastic way of investigating all those kinds of things. But I'd been investigating it for nearly a year, but suddenly I was on the bus home from school. Suddenly, it was as if Jesus walked onto the bus. Now, he didn't walk onto the bus, but as if he'd walked onto the bus. And it was just me and him, and it was like, this is my moment. He's made a moment, an opportunity for me. I have to respond. And as a result, I ran home from the bus stop. I ran up to my bedroom, and I surrendered my life to Jesus, age 15. So many of us could share that story. We could go and visit the kids right now, and many of the kids would have the same story as that. It's something that happens to so many of us. And the reason I'm telling you that is because what I want to say to you is, maybe today is your day. There are people in this room, there are people in the other rooms who haven't yet had that moment. Maybe today is the day where Jesus stands in front of you and calls your name. And we're definitely going to make an opportunity for you later on if that is you. But also for all of us this morning, in a sense, is we have an opportunity and an invitation to just inhabit this story for a moment and to just experience Jesus coming into our lives afresh and calling our name, calling us into new things, calling us deeper into a journey with him. This is an invitation that all of us have this morning. And so what I want to ask is, what is that actually like? Like, what actually happens when Jesus calls our name, calls us into something, whispers some kind of command or invitation into our hearts and our lives? What actually happens in that moment? And the first thing is, it's a simple call. It's a simple call. Do you know what struck me about this moment is, you know, Matthew records it, and he was there, right? And what he records is, firstly, it wasn't much of a conversation, right? Jesus says 2 words, and Matthew doesn't get to say any. It's like, follow me. And that's the full extent of the conversation. Matthew has been carefully recording so many conversations. There are so many words of Jesus. I don't know whether you've got one of these Bibles. My Bible's got all of the words of Jesus in red. And in Matthew's gospel, more than any other gospel, there are loads and loads of red words. Jesus says lots of things to lots of people. There are lots of conversations between Jesus and other people. But in this moment, it isn't a conversation. It's a command. Just a very stripped back, very pared down, very simple, follow me. The other thing that strikes me is it isn't really an invitation either. You know, there's no kind of, would you like to follow me? Or I don't know what you're doing with, say, the rest of your life, but if you wanted to, you could follow me. There's no invitation about it. In fact, it's just like a command. For the language geeks around us, it's a present active imperative, right? Present, Like, this is happening right now. Active, it's not passive. In other words, this isn't going to happen to you. No one's going to do it for you. You're going to do it. And it's an imperative. It's a command. You're doing this right now. And that's it. And Matthew has an opportunity to either respond and ultimately be obedient, or to not. That's the full extent of it. And again, so many of us have experienced those kinds of moments with Jesus, where Jesus says, I want you to go and take that job. Or I want you to go and live in that place. Or I want you to go and speak to that person. Or you're going to forgive that person right now. Or whatever it is. So many of us have had moments where Jesus has stepped into our world and given us a command. And it's kind. You know, Jesus is not unkind. He's always kind. He always has our best interests at heart. But ultimately, it's always a command. And it demands a response of obedience. It's been my privilege and joy to follow Jesus for 30 years, and that's been my experience. That ultimately, when Jesus says you've got to do that, if he's the Lord, you're going to do it. It's a simple call. Secondly, it's an unlikely call. Before I was like a professional Christian, I had an actual proper job in the real world, working with real people. And I worked in IT for a few years, just beside London Bridge. Pretty much, I think they knocked the building down to build the Shard. That's where I used to work. And it was a kind of a startup, you know. It was run by these couple of guys. They were just trying to get things off the ground. And so what really mattered to them was, got to make sure we get the right staff on the team. You know, it's really, really important. And so I watched them. They were so intentional with how they recruited people. They spent thousands of pounds on recruitment agencies and so on. And then when they had a bunch of people, they scrutinized their CVs, you know, to check that they were absolutely exactly as they'd been described. And then they invited people for an interview, and they gave them group tasks and scenarios. And you know, like, then they take them for dinner, and they give them a couple of glasses of wine, and then they watch them like a hawk to see exactly how they behaved. It was like they really wanted to make sure. Why were they doing that? Because, you know, like, the quality of the people on the team is everything when you're trying to achieve something you're passionate about. And it actually isn't just IT, it turns out. There are loads of different environments where you just want to choose exactly the right people, right? You know, you don't want the Prime Minister to be like, well, it doesn't really matter. You know, like, this isn't a political statement, by the way. Just in case, you know, you don't want the Prime Minister to say, well, I'm just going to put some people around the cabinet table. It doesn't really matter who they are or what they've done before. You're not going to do that in the media, are you? You're not going to be like, need to find someone to present the Antiques Roadshow. Let's just go and find anyone off the street. They could do that. Sports. Doesn't matter what sport it is. Doesn't matter whether it's darts or chess. Those are my kind of sports. Or, rugby or football or whatever it is. Sorry to mention the rugby. But doesn't matter. You're always going to choose the best people available for the right task. And so that's why it's so surprising, because nobody for any team ever is choosing Matthew. Because Matthew's a tax collector. Now, I won't ask for a show of hands if anyone works for HMRC here, but I can imagine that being a tax collector becomes awkward in certain social situations. You know, I can imagine that, you know, what do you do for a living in a dinner party or something like that would be like super awkward. I collect people's taxes for a living. It's like, doesn't go down terribly well. But in this place and this time, like 2,000 years ago, to be a tax collector was like the worst possible thing. You know, the land of Judea was occupied by the Romans, and the Romans were determined to squeeze as much cash out of those occupied people as possible. Like, they were like, let's keep them alive, but let's take everything else. And so they were taxing their incomes, they were taxing people per head, they were taxing their land and so on. They were just taxing everything they possibly could. And one of the things that they were taxing was what you would maybe call like import and export. So they would put tax collectors' booths on all major ports and also on all major roads. And whoever would pass by, they would be like, I'm just going to check your belongings, and I'm going to take out pretty much anything valuable because, that's like a tax. And what they used to do was they would employ local people to do the dirty work, right? So just imagine, you're just doing your everyday business, you're traveling along the road, and then suddenly there's a man there and he's like reaching into your bags. He's, I think I'll have that, and just putting things in his pocket. And it's like, what are you doing? He's always taxing for, and essentially he's taking everything he possibly can of value out of your possessions. It would be a bit like in our day, like your next door neighbor just coming round to your house and just going, I'll have that clock, and I'll have that microwave, and I'll have that TV. It's for the government, you need to give it to me. And then fine well that most of it is appearing in their house as their microwave and their clock, and then some of it is going on to Al-Qaeda. It's like, this is not good. They were a bit like, if you think about the Nazi collaborators during the war, it's like, these are people who are profoundly unpopular people. And so if you're like recruiting a team to achieve anything in life, you could be running a sports team or a political cabinet or a business, nobody is choosing Matthew. Jesus chose Matthew. Jesus chose Matthew. And it tells us something about how in the eyes of Jesus, nobody is beyond his plan and his purposes. Nobody. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what you've done. Doesn't matter where you've been. You might be excluded from every other place and environment, but Jesus is including you. I was having a medical checkup recently, and I was just chatting to the lady who's doing this medical checkup, and it's super awkward, and she's like, what do you do for a living? I hate that question, because as soon as you say, I'm sort of like a minister or a pastor, that just usually cuts the conversation completely dead. And so, I'm thinking of a clever way to say it, but in the end I just say I'm a pastor. And she says, I always cry when I go to churches. I said, it's really interesting because I've had this conversation about 100 times. Like most people cry when they come to church for the first time or when they haven't been to church for a long time. She was like, really? I said, yeah, that happens all the time. And then she said, well, my husband says, if ever I was to set foot in a church, I'd be struck by lightning. And I say, that's the other thing that people say, because it absolutely is, isn't it? Like that, people say, if I was, I wouldn't be welcome in your church. And when you think about a really great answer that you could have said about 2 weeks after the event, I wish I'd said, can I introduce you to someone called Matthew, who is a tax collector? Because he wasn't struck by lightning. He was included. I don't know what you're hearing Jesus call you to do, but he's trustworthy and he never discounts anyone. It's an unlikely call. Thirdly, it's an all-in call. Do you notice how when Matthew is called by Jesus and Jesus says, follow him, the very next moment, Jesus is like taken over his house and all of his possessions. I just want to warn you, that's a thing. Right, that happens. Jesus, if you choose to follow Jesus, you choose to obey him, you're not just giving him your heart or your intellectual assent to something, he's taking over your life. I was laughing so much in the worship this morning because we've got a baptism here at this site, and there's signs up everywhere saying, warning, deep water. We should just keep those signs up. Because if you encounter Jesus, I'm warning you, you're going to get into deep water really, really quickly. He's going to take over your life. Something happens that's amazing, though. When we go all in with Jesus, we give him everything that we have, everything that we are, all of our hopes, all of our ambitions. He does something beautiful with it all. And do you see what happens? There's Jesus. He's in Matthew's house, and with Matthew's dining table, eating Matthew's food and drinking Matthew's wine. But lo and behold, he's using it for incredible kingdom purposes. He's bringing in all the people who no one else wants to talk to. He's including them, and then he's sharing the good news of the kingdom with them too. And so, I want to actually suggest that this would ask a question of us, which is your house just your home? Is your house just the place where you eat and sleep and watch the Traitors? Is that the full extent of the purpose of your house? Is it just your home, or is it a place where Jesus does things to other people? What would it look like for you to offer your home, everything that you have and are, to Jesus and allow him to use them for his plan and purposes? When I was a kid in primary school, we had a school mouse. And I didn't really love the idea of a school mouse. I'm not saying it was under the floorboards. It was in a cage on Mrs. Moore's desk. And I was kind of okay with that. This is okay. It's in a cage. It's not going anywhere. Can anyone guess the name of the mouse, by the way? No, it wasn't Mickey, it was Nigel. Okay, so Nigel the mouse is on Mrs. Moore's desk. There's the mouse, everything's great, it's all fine, until the Christmas holidays comes around and Mrs. Moore gives Nigel to me to take home for Christmas. I was absolutely horrified, and I imagine my parents were also absolutely horrified. It's fine for the mouse to be at school, I just don't want the mouse in my house. And my point is that there's a kind of occupational hazard with us as Christians, that the danger is that Jesus stays at church. I'm all in for Jesus on a Sunday in that building because it's not very disruptive. But if I was to go all in with Jesus at home, then it might disrupt my life. And it seems to me that this passage with Jesus and Matthew, it's casting a vision for us of what it would look like if we as followers of Jesus were to go all in and just give him everything. Jesus took up residence in Matthew's life. And lastly, number 4, it's a contested call. It's a contested call. Do you notice no sooner has Matthew chosen to follow Jesus then that call is being undermined. Along come these Pharisees and so on, and they're saying, should your teacher be hanging out with people like that? You see that in verse 11. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? They're not asking that question, by the way, because they're interested in the answer. Could you just fill us in on what the rationale is there, what Jesus is thinking? We will have explained it to you, I expect. No. They're trying to undermine everything that Jesus is trying to do. I don't think a proper teacher would be doing things like that. I don't think he'd be hanging out with people like that. They're trying to sow doubt into Matthew's mind. And actually, that's really normal. Happens all the time. That we hear Jesus whisper something into our lives, and no sooner has it landed in our hearts that the enemy is trying to undermine it. You see it happening right at the beginning of the book in Genesis chapter 1, don't you? The serpent comes into the garden, and what does he say? Did God really say you shouldn't eat from that tree? And it's not like the serpent's interested in the answer, Is that actually what God said? No, it's just seeking to undermine everything that God has said to Adam and Eve. That's how it works. And again, we could go around the room or around one of those rooms and ask the same question. Is that your experience? That you've heard God whisper something into your soul, and no sooner has it landed then the enemy's trying to take it away, take the legs out from underneath it, trying to undermine the call. We just need to wake up and realize that that's what happens, right? I so love the testimony of our friends, John and Eleanor Mumford. Our church is a Vineyard church because it belongs to essentially a movement, a family of churches called the Vineyard, which is about 2,500 churches in 100 different countries around the world. And John and Eleanor Mumford started the first ever Vineyard church in the UK in 1987. And they're amazing people. I think they're going to come and visit soon, which would be really, really fun. But they did, you will have realized already, this church is like the lunatic fringe, right? But they didn't, John and Ellie didn't come from the lunatic fringe. That they were from a very conservative, straight down the line kind of a church, and a very traditional church. And they kind of had this perspective on all kinds of different things, and everything kind of went up in the air when somebody prayed for Eleanor because she had meningitis, and she was immediately healed, spontaneously healed of severe meningitis, and it kind of messed with everything she thought she knew about how God was working today and so on. And she was like, we're going to have to find out how this really works. And so they went on this journey of reading through the scriptures, trying to understand, traveling to different parts of the world to try to learn from people who were seeing God do those kinds of things all the time. And as part of that, they began to sense, this is what God's saying, that God does do stuff like this today, that as part of my sharing of the gospel, as part of my bearing witness to Jesus wherever I am, I should be offering to pray for people and see them healed. And they knew in their hearts that's exactly what God was saying. They knew to be obedient to God, they should be offering to pray for people. Like, fast forward a little bit of time. I forget the exact story. Eleanor told it when she came here years and years ago. But I think they were walking past a tennis court. And as they were walking past the tennis court, there was a guy on the tennis court, and he was kind of limping off the tennis court. He's obviously injured himself. And they looked at each other as if to say, this is what, we know what we're supposed to do now. We're supposed to offer to pray for him. And they just kept looking at each other, and then looking at the guy, and looking at each other, looking at the guy. And all the time, these doubts just coming into their minds. Oh, what would he think of us? We'd look so stupid, we're not even quite sure whether we've heard God right. I'm not sure. And like all these doubts suddenly appearing in their minds. And so they just let the moment pass. And then when they were back in their house later on, Eleanor turns to John and she just says, well, are we going to do this or aren't we? And ultimately knowing that every call of God is going to be in my life is going to be contested, I have to make a decision. Which is, am I going to allow the voice of the enemy and the undermining thoughts to stop me, prevent me from doing God's will? Or am I just going to decide that nothing is going to prevent me from being obedient to what God is asking me to do? Well, our friend Steve Nicholson, he says it like this: it's so important that we don't doubt in the darkness what we've heard God say in the light. And I wonder whether there are people in this room today or in one of the other rooms who just know that God has asked them to do something. And you're in the season where it's all being totally contested. What if you were to just decide, doesn't matter how much this is being undermined, doesn't matter how many doubts are in my mind, I know God has said me to do this, and so I am going to choose to obey. Why don't we stand? I'm just going to pray, and then I'll hand back to the other site pastors. And so, Jesus, we hear you. We're aware that you're stepping into our world today, and you're commanding obedience. And so what we want to say to you today, Jesus, is we hear you and we will do what you're asking us to do. Our choice today, however it plays out, whatever it's going to look like, is our choice is obedience. We know that your way is the best way. Amen. Amen.